Have you ever irrationally stuck to a job because you're thinking, this is what I went to school for? Abandoning all the time I spent studying for the degree and paying tuition would be such a waste. Or you're still operating an unprofitable business, but you borrowed money from friends and family to launch the business and you didn't want to disappoint them. These are prime examples of the sunk cost fallacy. It's one of the most common decision making pitfalls in life and business, and why starting over and reinventing yourself can be so difficult. In this video, I will cover what the sunk cost fallacy is, the history of sunk cost fallacy, the 5 psychological factors that feed into this, and how to avoid sunk cost fallacy during your reinvention journey. What is the sunk cost fallacy? The sunk cost fallacy is our tendency to continue with an activity we've invested money, effort, or time into, even if the current costs outweigh the benefits. The sunk cost fallacy can describe trivial things like continuing to watch a boring movie you've purchased, or more serious matters like refusing to pull out of a failing business investment. Whenever we fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy, we make irrational decisions that are against our best interest. And since this tendency is so deeply ingrained in human behavior, it's important to understand how the sunk cost fallacy works, so we can make good decisions for our future rather than dig ourselves into a deeper and deeper hole. History of the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is a type of cognitive bias, a thinking error that makes us interpret information and affects the decisions we make. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman first coined the idea of cognitive bias in 1972. Laying the foundation for further research into sunk cost fallacy. In 2002, Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work on cognitive biases in business decision-making, including the sunk cost fallacy. Over the years, behavioral scientists and economists have tried to pinpoint why the sunk cost fallacy happens. Richard Thaler first introduced the sunk cost fallacy, concluding that people have a greater tendency to use a good or service when they've invested money into it. Later, scientists Hal Arks and Catherine Bloomer expanded on Thaler's hypothesis when they published an article on sunk costs in the journal Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. Arks and Bloomer conducted a series of experiments that illustrated the psychology of sunk costs in action, specifically how the idea of sunk costs influences our decisions. And as a hint, it affects us more than we realize. For example, one questionnaire study asked participants to imagine they had accidentally booked 2 ski trips in one weekend, one $100 trip to Michigan and another $50 trip to Wisconsin. Even though the researchers told participants they'd enjoy the Wisconsin trip more, the majority of people still said they would go on the Michigan trip. After some mental accounting, participants chose the course of action with a greater initial investment, even though they wouldn't enjoy it as much. The psychology behind the sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy makes you your own worst enemy. Scientists have identified at least number 1, loss aversion. Loss aversion is the tendency to avoid losses because the idea of losing something that just hits your psyche differently than the idea of gaining the same thing. For example, winning $100 feels good, but losing $100 feels horrible. As a result, we'll go out of our way to avoid losing $100, even if that means sacrificing our chance to win. If you grew up in a lower income household, this tends to be more severe. With the sunk cost fallacy, loss aversion makes us stick with poor investments or bad relationships because we don't want to feel bad about losing. Number 2, the framing effect. The framing effect happens when people pick options based on whether they're framed in a positive or negative light. The effect plays into sunk cost fallacy because when we follow through on a decision, we can frame it as an overall success. When we don't follow through, we often create a narrative of failure, even if cutting our losses was actually the logical choice. For example, in one of my previous businesses, I had an idea to work with Twitch streamers. I thought their audience would be open to learning about products. Midway through, I realized that I wasn't getting the traffic and conversions I expected, and that I would be better off investing the remaining money in paid advertising. But in my mind, that meant this Twitch streamer program was a failure. So I decided to stick with it, even though my time and money would be better spent elsewhere. Unrealistic optimism. Unrealistic optimism occurs when people believe they're less likely to experience a negative event than other people. With the sunk cost fallacy, this means we're likely to overestimate our chances of winning and underestimate our chances of losing, especially if we've invested money in something. For example, the business I raised the most money from investors was actually my biggest failure. I thought I would be able to leverage my growth marketing background from the gaming and tech industry when launching a skincare brand. But there were a lot of things I didn't take into account, like logistics, working with overseas suppliers, distribution channels for physical products, the amount of marketing resources that was necessary for new product launches, and competition from similar brands. Since I poured a lot of my own money and money from outside investors, I was more likely to believe it will pan out, regardless of the actual data and market conditions. The fourth psychological effect is a sense of personal responsibility. When you feel responsible for previous expenditures, you're more likely to fall prey to sunk cost fallacy. It's relatively easy to change a decision made by someone else, but a lot harder to discontinue a project you've personally decided to invest in. This is especially problematic for entrepreneurs, as their business is their baby, and they went all in to make it successful. Because they have a vested interest in the project's success, they will ignore all the signs in hopes there will be a turnaround. And the last effect is a desire to not appear wasteful. Business owners may continue with poor investments because they feel guilty about wasting money. Imagine you've bought a ticket to a movie, but 30 minutes in, you absolutely hate it. You stay for the whole boring ideal for two reasons. One, you don't want other people in the theater to think you're wasting money. And two, you personally feel bad about wasting money. The same concept applies when you keep using a software tool you've purchased, even though it's not working for you or your team. But you don't want to waste your investment, so you stick it out. Ambitious, high-achieving business owners and entrepreneurs are quite susceptible to sunk costs, like opportunity costs, like the time you invested that you could have spent on something more productive, or maybe something you enjoy more. Effort, like tasks that are particularly challenging. Mental strain, like the worry you've experienced. The facilities and overhead, materials and equipment. Investments like purchasing a business or real estate, annual subscription, and non-refundable business costs, like legal fees or advertising costs. Is sunk cost fallacy really so bad? In short, yes. When we let sunk cost fallacy influence our decisions, we often make bad choices that hurt us. Instead of facing reality, we fall into a vicious cycle that often includes an escalation of our commitments, like time, money, and energy, even if it's not in our best interest. The more we invest, the more committed we are, and the more resources we funnel into that initial bad decision. So how do we combat sunk cost fallacy? Luckily, we can avoid the trap of sunk cost fallacy. Here are 3 strategies to help you make rational decisions for your future rather than be stuck in the past. Number 1, be aware. Just being aware of the sunk cost fallacy is a great first step to avoid its pull. If you're still watching this video, you're already less likely to make irrational decisions. That's because when you understand how the sunk cost fallacy works, you can check the cognitive biases each time you make a decision. To do this, ask yourselves the following questions. What am I afraid of losing? How is that fear holding me back? How have I defined failure and success for this situation? Do those definitions make sense? What is the actual probability that my project will succeed? What would I do if someone else had decided to invest? What advice would I give to a friend in my situation? Am I afraid of appearing wasteful, either to myself or to others? Is this fear rational? The second strategy is data and systems are your friends. Before investing in a new project, whether it's a hobby, a relationship, or a new business, you should identify specific success metrics you want to achieve. Setting measurable goals upfront gives you a clear target to aim for and a way to measure progress. If your project isn't meeting its goals, you have a data-backed reason to adjust your approach or simply cut your losses and move on. My favorite framework to set goals is SMART, and I'll link the video where I talk about that in the description below. On top of that, decision fatigue is real, especially for business owners, entrepreneurs, or executives who seem to be pulled in many different directions. Creating your own decision-making systems can help you select the best option between different choices. For example, in America, we can get overwhelmed with the amount of things we can buy. And when making a purchase that's not really a necessity, I ask myself two questions. Number one, will it bring me joy? And number two, will it save me time? If I answer yes to both questions, I buy the item. If I answer no to both, I don't buy the item. If it's 50-50, I still sleep on it. And if I still have mixed feelings about it, I don't buy it and move on. Worst case, I can always return the item. The third strategy is set regular check-ins with yourself. The sunk cost fallacy can be tricky to recognize, especially if you don't have regular check-ins with yourself. If you never considered whether your current job, business, or relationship still works, your life can languish for months or even years. This is why it's important to set up regular progress reports to review your life. Whether it's end of day, week, month, or year, set a regular time to journal your activities, your feelings when doing these activities, and how they align with your values. For example, I set aside 15 minutes at the end of each day to review what I've done, what went well, and what didn't go as well. I've logged these into a Notion database or a Google Doc, and over time I was able to notice patterns and trends. So remember, just because you've sunk time, money, and effort into a project, it doesn't mean you have to go down with the ship. With these strategies, you can let go of the past and make decisions on what's best for you and your future. The sunk cost fallacy makes you your own worst enemy, but with some self-awareness and honest check-ins, you'll be on your way in your reinvention journey. If you love tips like this, be sure to subscribe so you won't miss my next tips to guide you on your reinvention journey.